from the heart of where innovation, money, and power collide. In Silicon Valley and beyond, this is Bloomberg Technology with Emily Chang.
I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Bitcoin plunge, the cryptocurrency slides almost 10% on a day that was supposed to be cause for celebration. El Salvador has officially adopted Bitcoin as a national currency. Why the rocky start? We will discuss. Plus, Elizabeth Holmes heads to court this week in a long-delayed, much-anticipated trial. A jury will decide whether she's guilty of conspiracy and fraud. The reporter who first blew the lid off the Theranos story years ago will join us this hour. And LinkedIn co-founder and one of Silicon Valley's most successful venture capitalists has invested in some of the most high-growth tech companies ever, including Facebook and Airbnb. Reid Hoffman joins us to talk about how entrepreneurs today can become masters of their own destiny and scale. We'll get to all that in a moment, but first let's get a look at the markets with our own Taylor Riggs. And Taylor, of course, we can't talk about what happened in the markets today without talking about crypto. Take it away.
I know. I feel like I was the sell signal for crypto earlier this morning. But first, let's talk about just sort of where we are on some of the major indices. Emily, so interesting. We came in this morning and it felt like a reflationary trade all over again. But all of that reversed as you saw some movement back into big tech, which has traditionally been sort of that safe haven theme, really in part led by Apple and Amazon and some of those traditional safe haven sectors. That is really what was holding up the market today. If you change up the board, you see in this terminal chart that we have in the terminal, that really divergence between the NASDAQ that was leading the gains versus the Russell 2000 and the divergence out of that reflationary, inflationary theme. So that really sets us up for really what was a pretty good day for technology. Until, of course, we get to Bitcoin. And this is, of course, Emily, where I leave you. Take a look at not only the cryptocurrency, Bitcoin now, okay, this shows that it's up 0.3%. That number really, Emily, should be down 10% because this opened up the market this morning at above 50,000. Take a look at what has happened. We plunged to 44. We're trying to hold on to 47,000. Everything else like Coinbase, Riot, blockchain, falling, of course, in sympathy as well.
All right, Taylor, thanks so much for that very comprehensive roundup. As we just heard there, a rocky start to Bitcoin's biggest test in its 12-year history. The rollout of the cryptocurrency as legal tender in El Salvador met with a price crash, technical glitches across the board. It also divided some pretty high-profile investors. Take a listen.
El Salvador, let's face it, it's on its back. It's got real problems. It's a bankrupt country, in fact. So they're grasping at straws with Bitcoin, but I don't think it's going to spread to other countries.
Whenever you're doing a new technology rollout, there are glitches. And so I guess the real question is come back in 6 weeks or 12 weeks, and let's talk about how it's working, for the people of El Salvador, for the system itself.
But El Salvador's leader remained optimistic. President Nayib Bukele said in a tweet that his country has taken advantage of the crash to buy the dip, adding 150 coins to take its total holding to 550, worth about $26 million. We've got so much to dig into with this story. I want to bring in FalconX head of institutional coverage, Aya Kantorovich, and our Bloomberg News Central American reporter, Michael McDonald, who's usually based in San Jose, Costa Rica, but joins us today from Chicago. Michael, start with you. What does this mean for Bitcoin? What does this mean for El Salvador?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned today, it became legal tender in El Salvador. So what it means for Bitcoin is there are businesses in El Salvador that will be required to accept this if they're technologically able. We've seen several businesses today start to accept it in El Salvador. It's a lot of the larger ones, McDonald's, Pizza Hut, Starbucks. We've seen transactions in Bitcoin go through at some of these larger chains in El Salvador. Also, citizens in El Salvador, if they want, they can pay their taxes in Bitcoin as well. So, it did become legal tender. It is going to operate alongside the dollar for now in El Salvador. So the dollar will still be a national currency there as well. So if people don't want to use Bitcoin, they can use the dollar as well. But businesses will be required to accept it if they are technologically able as of today.
That said, with the president saying to buy the dip, the technical glitches, Aya, Should we be at all skeptical of what's happening here?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, it will take time. I agree with what Mike Novogratz said, that this is going to take a lot of time. The infrastructure in order to accept these payments at scale will take significant manpower and time and investment as well. And I think while they're putting into place thousands of ATMs, the payment processors in all of these different businesses will take time. But I think for a country, taking a step back from what Michael said, even around some of those larger companies, for a country where a quarter of their GDP is based on remittances, I think this is much larger in terms of the impact it can have on the population and their ability to move money across borders that perhaps they can't today, but could if they just had a mobile device.
That said, the population isn't necessarily too excited about it. Michael, I've seen polls that show a lot of distrust among folks who live in the country. How widespread is that, and could that really slow down broader adoption?
Sure, yeah, we've seen polls in the weeks leading up to this that about 70% of El Salvadorans prefer to use the dollar to Bitcoin. And we've also seen that about 70% have said that they would like to see this Bitcoin law repealed. So there is quite a bit of skepticism of it on the ground. I also think there's a pretty large financial education learning curve. El Salvador is not a country that has a lot of its citizens using the traditional banking system. It's cash is still king in El Salvador. So when you bring in this sort of new technology like cryptocurrency, there is sort of a hesitancy and there is sort of some pushback at first. So we are seeing a lot of people that are skeptical on the ground. There were a lot of questions this morning with the Chivo wallet. People couldn't download it. It was offline for a little while, so the government could fix some glitches. So it was a little bit of a rocky start, and there is some skepticism in El Salvador.
That said, Aya, we've learned that we can never judge Bitcoin on any given day. But what do you make of what's behind this price move? How much does this have to do with El Salvador, or is it something else?
Yeah, good question. So it had nothing to do really with El Salvador. What we saw today was very much what we saw historically with BitMEX liquidations. And so you're seeing over the last couple of weeks, a lot of whether it's retail and institution on overseas exchanges pile into derivatives products for futures in products that maybe they didn't necessarily know or were funding correctly. And there was a leverage waterfall. And so cascading liquidations happened this morning. Now, what I really interesting is that this was very much like a bullish bear day. And so we saw that bounce back really quickly. So as was discussed earlier, we dropped down to 44. We're now at a support level of 47. I still think we're very much nearing that 60K mark. And so we're continuing to see a lot of, I think, of the 2.6 billion in liquidations, 1.1 billion was in Bitcoin, 700 million was in Ethereum. And this was largely driven by Ethereum and DeFi assets. So still very bullish on long-term view for price on Bitcoin.
If you're that optimistic, when do we get to 60K? And also, we've had the co-founder of Kraken on the show who say we're going to get to 100 before the end of the year. Would you agree?
Yeah, so may not agree with Jesse on that. He's very bullish, but that's a good question. I think we'll see it in the next couple of weeks. Really, what pushed us beyond 50K wasn't the leverage on Bitcoin. It was people, accumulating Bitcoin at spot and buying it in size. And what we were seeing at FalconX, at least today, is a lot of these institutions took the opportunity to buy the dip. At not only Bitcoin, but across different assets. And so I think we'll see that 60K sooner than we expect, I think, in the next couple of weeks.
All right. Aya Kantorovich of FalconX, thanks so much, as well as our own Michael McDonald, who reports for us on the ground in Central America. Thank you both. Well, Apple has set the date for its biggest product launch of the year. The company has announced it'll unveil its latest line of iPhones and other devices Tuesday, September 14th. Bloomberg had previously reported the iPhone maker has been working on 4 new iPhones, as well as Apple Watches with larger screens, AirPods, and some new MacBook Pros. The event will be held virtually. Meantime, Apple has lost the head of its car project to Ford. The automaker announced Doug Fields will be joining as Chief Advanced Technology and Embedded Systems Officer. Fields' resume includes time as a top engineer at Tesla. We're going to have more on this story later this hour with our own Ed Ludlow. And coming up, from the boardroom to the courtroom, Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes is set to face a jury and possibly 20 years in prison over her failed blood testing startup, Theranos. After the break, we will speak to the man who exposed the Silicon Valley scandal. Next, this is Bloomberg.
Our company is about realizing a world in which early detection and prevention become a reality. And we want to take this company to a place in which, because of our work, person by person, everyone has the right to get access to their own health information and to be able to do so at incredibly low cost and in a wonderful way. And that means changing the way we think lab testing is done today.
That was Elizabeth Holmes, the first and only time I interviewed her about her blood testing startup Theranos. It was just a week before the Wall Street Journal published a massive investigation on the company. And the last chapter of this Silicon Valley scandal is being written as we speak. Opening arguments in the trial of Elizabeth Holmes start at a San Jose courthouse Wednesday. Holmes facing charges of defrauding patients and investors about the potential of Theranos technology. She could face up to 20 years in prison if convicted. Our next guest conducted that original Wall Street Journal investigation, later published a book about it, and is now hosting the podcast Bad Blood, the final chapter. Joining us now, John Carreyrou. John, thank you so much for joining us. You're actually in San Jose. You've been in and out of the courtroom over the last week, and news just broke that you are on the defense witness list. What does this mean?
That's right. The defense just posted on the docket in the case the list of the witnesses that they may call during their case in chief, meaning once the prosecution has rested its part of the case and the defense presents its own. And I am, I think, number 6 on the list. The interesting thing is that prosecutors, the 3 main prosecutors in this case, are also on this list, as well as officials from the FDA and CMS, the 2 federal health regulatory agencies. So what this tells me is clearly one of the arguments that the defense is going to make is that this was a witch hunt. It was a witch hunt by the government, and the government was in league with me, allegedly. That's what they're going to argue to the jury. And I think they're going to try to show that those health agencies, FDA and CMS, cracked down on Theranos in a way that was harsher than they might otherwise have. They'll try to make the case that I biased them, that I colored their judgment, and that basically, none of this would have come to pass if I hadn't been in contact with them and if they hadn't read my stories.
Well, we'll certainly be watching to see if you get called, John. You, of course, broke the story about her deception. You say she was indeed, quote, faking it, lying, leading a massive fraud, and she has maintained her innocence. In fact, her defense involves pointing the finger at Sunny Balwani, her former business partner, and also her ex-boyfriend. She says he mentally abused her. What do you make of that defense?
Yeah, that's another line of defense that we learned about in the past 10 days. She's going to allege that he was sexually and mentally abusive, and that he effectively deprived her of her free will and of her agency, and that as a result, she's innocent of the charges. As I say in my podcast, it's an incredibly hard defense strategy to pull off. You have to get those 12 jurors to believe that all those times that she was addressing audiences at the height of her fame, when she looked incredibly charismatic and self-possessed and charming and intelligent, that she was never really in control, that she was a puppet who was controlled by a puppeteer, and that puppeteer was Sunny Balwani, her boyfriend at the time, and the number 2 executive at Theranos. They're going to have to get the jury to believe that this mind control was going on for the better part of 12 years. It's a lot to ask, but who knows? She's incredibly, in my experience, in my 6.5 years of reporting on this, I found that she's a chameleon. And she's going to sell this hard. She's going to go on the witness stand and play the naive young woman who was manipulated by an older man. And who knows, the jury might just eat out of her hand.
Now, things have gotten complicated in just the months and weeks leading up to the trial. Some of this, which you report on in your podcast, she also had a baby, which delayed the trial. That's led to a round of different kind of speculation. Talk to us about the twists and turns over just the last year here.
Right. So first of all, the case was delayed for more than a year because of the pandemic. This was originally supposed to go to trial in the summer of 2020. It was delayed several times because of the pandemic. And then it was supposed to go to trial in early July of this year. And it was delayed again by another 6 weeks because she was pregnant. She gave birth in early July. And finally, jury selection began last week. But, the wheels of justice have turned very slowly in this case. If you recall, my first Wall Street Journal story came out in October of 2015. I started my investigation early 2015. We're now nearly 7 years later, this is still a case that hasn't yet been decided. So I'm personally anxious for this to happen and for this to move forward.
All right, John Carreyrou, host of the podcast Bad Blood, the final chapter, of course, author of the book. We'll hope to catch up with you as the trial progresses. Thank you. All right, coming up, revving up to go green. The king of sports cars, Lamborghini, embarks on an EV push as the European Union sets a deadline on gasoline-powered cars. We're going to have the details from the Munich Motor Show next. This is Bloomberg.
We put our scale to work. We have been investing with our suppliers in new capacity, and we expect material supply improvements as we get at the end of this calendar year. So we're going to enter 2022 with a much more balanced supply-demand equation.
Qualcomm CEO Cristiano Amon there speaking at the Munich Motor Show about his timeline for a chip supply turnaround. He wasn't the only chip maker at that event. Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger also announced his company will dedicate production at its plant in Ireland to making semiconductors for the car industry.
Today, we're announcing the European foundry services at Intel 16 and other nodes out of our Ireland facility. And we believe this has an opportunity to help expedite the end to the supply shortage, and we're engaging with auto and other industries to help build on those capabilities.
And it wasn't just chips on everyone's mind at the Munich Motor Show. A plan by the EU to phase out internal combustion engines by the year 2035. Also a key talking point. Italy, home to a number of high-powered sports car makers like Ferrari and Lamborghini, has been exploring ways to shield those companies from the new rules. But Lamborghini CEO Stefan Winkelmann told Bloomberg that exemption isn't necessary.
We have a clear roadmap. 2022 will be the last year of a firework of combustion engines only. And then in 23 and 24, we are going to hybridize all our lineup. So there will be the new Aventador first, then there will be the new Urus, and then there will be the follow of the Huracan end of 24. And this is allowing us to cut CO2 emissions starting from 2025 by at least 50% in comparison to today. So we are engaged and we are taking tough decisions.
I feel like I'm going to pass out when I think about all this. It's too much excitement for me. You're going to have a new Aventador. What is that going to be like? What's the powertrain going to be?
It will be a complete new car with a new name. We call it Aventador Follow at time being, but it will have a new V12, naturally aspirated engine, and it will be hybridized. It will be a plug-in hybrid. More than this, I can't tell you right now.
The big concern at the car show has been the chip shortage, the supply chain. It's not getting better. How does it look from your vantage point?
But so far, so good. We have no shortage at all. We check this on a daily basis for sure, but at time being we are not touched by the shortage of the chips. Keep in mind that we are not a big car manufacturer, so we are...
What are you making, 7,000, 8,000 cars a year?
Yeah, this year we will be at 8,000 something. We don't know exactly, but it will be a wonderful year for Lamborghini, and we are really looking forward to do another best year also then in 2022.
You just flew in out of Milan. There was a story out of Italy yesterday that everybody was talking about at the car show, trying to get an exemption for Lamborghini and Ferrari, for the high-end supercar makers, to keep producing internal combustion engines past 2035. Do you think it'll work?
But it's not about 2035, it's not decided yet. But what I can tell you is that it's not only about Europe, so we have to be prepared to be compliant worldwide. So it's useless to have, let's say, an exemption and everybody's doing thumbs down. We have to work with what the legislator is telling us, and the sustainability will be even bigger after 2030. So we have to work with the, let's say, with the legislation which is going to be in place. And we are well prepared. As I said, hybridization is the first step. For this decade, for the super sports cars, this is going to work out. We will see what we're going to do with the Urus at the end of the decade. For sure, we will have a fourth model, which will be a full electric car, which we will launch in 2027. So we are going to divide somehow the lineup in the two super sports cars, so Aventador and Huracan follower, Urus and this fourth model. And we also look into the opportunity of having synthetic fuel after 2030. So this could be an opportunity to keep internal combustions with hybrid alive.
Lamborghini CEO Stefan Winkelmann there with our own Matt Miller. We're going to have more on the car industry after the break, including details about Ford's big hiring coup. We'll find out more about how the car maker lured a top Apple car executive next. Plus, we'll speak to LinkedIn co-founder and Masters of Scale podcast host Reid Hoffman about the surprising things he's learned from the world's top tech and business leaders, and how the pandemic may have changed what it means to scale for good. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Let's get more on Ford's hiring of the former head of Apple's car project. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow with us for more. Huge coup for Ford here. Ed, what can you tell us?
This is Doug Field. Of course, he led the special projects team at Apple, which we know was all around an electric vehicle with autonomous capabilities. He's actually leaving Apple for the second time. Sandwiched in between his two stints at Apple, he was at Tesla from 2013 to 18 and left in August 2018 when the company was really ramping up that Model 3 production. So, you know, he's a big name in the world of electric vehicles. He put Apple on the map with their efforts. Now he's going to Ford. You can actually see what Ford investors thought of it as well, because the stock had been under pressure for a few days before the holiday weekend. And then we actually saw it pop when that Bloomberg scoop first hit. Of course, the company later confirmed him. His job is going to be very focused on not just electric vehicles. We know Ford is going big on electrification, but the other things that come with it, digital service, high margin software, the future of autonomy, things like that. And it's interesting, over the last 12 months, where's the love been for Ford? Well, it's been in the equity markets. Look at how the stock has performed compared to Apple. You can see the investors are really loving this name, and all the efforts is making that CapEx commitment of $35 billion to really be a big player, not just in electrification, but autonomous vehicles as well. And now they've got Doug Field to help with that effort. Emily.
All right, we'll be watching how that one plays out. Ed, thanks so much. Well, longtime Silicon Valley investor and tech entrepreneur Reid Hoffman is out with a new book, Masters of Scale. He distills insights and hard-earned wisdom from leaders of iconic companies and startups like Apple, Netflix, Google, Microsoft, 23andMe, and more. Companies that are solving some of the world's most complex problems, or at least trying to. Joining us now, LinkedIn co-founder, Greylock partner, and host of the Masters of Scale podcast, Reid Hoffman. Reid, thank you so much for joining us. What's so great about your podcast and the book is that, of course, you've been through the trenches, you've gotten the no's, you've pushed through. And I'm so curious, you started doing these interviews in 2017, pre-pandemic. How has the word scale, or what it means to scale, changed post-pandemic? Has it changed at all?
Well, it certainly changes, because it changes. Scale and entrepreneurship is all about what the competitive landscape looks like. It's competitive landscape in competitive companies and products. It's competitive landscape for hiring talent. It's competitive landscape in developing and deploying new products. And part of the work on Masters of Scale, the podcast, now the book, Blitzscaling, is all basically that you have to actually, the first to scale is the technology company that sets the rules, sets the platform. And so that dynamic, that driving competitive force is still there. Now, the way you do it is different because supply chains have changed, hiring has changed, the way that teams operate has changed. How all of this stuff happens in a more remote and some kind hybrid environment is much more challenging. Now, the environment's still changing because, of course, maybe as we solve Delta, figure out kind of vaccination and testing, maybe actually, in fact, the hybrid gets much more back to work as well. So it's a constantly changing landscape.
Now, you interview everyone from Brian Chesky at Airbnb to some surprising guests like President Obama and A-Rod. The subtitle of the book is, in fact, Surprising Truths from the World's Most Successful Entrepreneurs. If you could pick one thing, and I know it's probably hard to do, which one of those truths surprised you most?
Well, I think the things that probably most surprised me is that the rules around entrepreneurship aren't just these kind of Silicon Valley lessons I've learned, but apply more broadly. It's talking to people who are mostly outside my network. So, Tyra Banks and how she made herself an enormously successful supermodel was approaching it like an entrepreneur. Franklin Leonard creating the Blacklist, A-Rod. All of these folks, actually, in fact, what you discover is these principles of entrepreneurship aren't just technology companies, aren't just kind of like the people who go, I'm going to go start a company, but how you're thinking about creating, something from nothing and then from something to, like huge scale.
Elon Musk has said entrepreneurship feels like swallowing glass and staring into the abyss of death. Do you think that anyone can be an entrepreneur, or does it take a special kind of person? Because it sounds terrifying.
Well, I think it's a good thing to think that it's terrifying. I used a jump off a cliff and assemble an airplane on the way down. It also is looking at the abyss below you, maybe a little bit less like swallowing glass. And it is very, very difficult. I do think that there's a combination of characteristics, a combination of risk tolerance, a combination of do you have the right safety net, which is one of the things that helps when you come from family with a little bit of money or other kinds of things. There's ways of doing that, a network that can support you, and that's part of some of where you have an easier time of it. But I do think that it can be learned. It's less taught, more learned. And so the experience doing it, joining companies, part of what we try to do in the podcast, in the courses app, in the book, is to say, here are the things that where you can be learning it, watching the journey, watching the experience, watching the lessons that these iconic folks who had to, in Elon's words, swallow glass, stare into the abyss, and yet still persevere.
Now, people get told no for all kinds of reasons. You speak to Sarah Blakely, the founder of Spanx, Tristan Walker of Bevel, obviously dealing with problems that, many potentially white male investors didn't understand. There's also John Foley, the CEO of Peloton, who got told no. This surprised me a number of times. They thought he was too old at 40 years old to be an entrepreneur. How many world-changing companies do you think aren't being started, aren't being built right now because of a lack of access to opportunity, because of discrimination and bias? And how well is Silicon Valley doing to change that?
So the answer is a huge number, right? Easily 2x, 3x, 4x the number of companies if we just got the talent networks and the networks accessed right. And Silicon Valley, I think very thankfully has in the last few years pretty committed to these efforts. I mean, at Greylock, we've been working with management leaders of tomorrow and a bunch of different kind of venture firms, 645 Ventures, others, in order to have the broader pipeline for entrepreneurs, for investors, for companies getting financed. We do special office hours because network building, not surprisingly, from a co-founder of LinkedIn, is the way that you ultimately address this and just have the market do it because there's so much talent and so much capability there, and we're losing out on it. Now, the reason why it's not so simple to solve, and you know, like for example, Tristan is one of the people we had on Masters of Scale. The reason why it's not so simple to solve is because we have this huge flood of a lot of noise where you're always looking for that signal. And so you have to make sure that the network gets built for, you know, the entrepreneurs of color, for women, for other sources in order to build this. But I think that we will see year by year progress, because I think now people are putting it in their dashboards. They're putting it in we must be doing this. And I think that then the engine will catch.
Meantime, some of the companies we're talking about here, Apple, Microsoft, these are companies worth more than $2 trillion. Google, Amazon, Facebook, almost there. Because of their scale, in part, they are facing regulatory scrutiny around the world. Is big in itself bad? Is scale, can scale potentially be one's downfall?
So I think it's a great question, and certainly they're getting pressure everywhere. Governments are uncomfortable because of, well, what's the throw weight, the profitability, the strength of these companies. On the other hand, part of when you get to how do we get the investment in the future we want? So for example, how do we get artificial intelligence created? Because artificial intelligence will be what creates robotics, which is what we'll have, if we have any hope, for example, in the US of a return to manufacturing, it's through artificial intelligence or robotics. That will come through investments that Microsoft, that, you know, Alphabet, that, you know, Amazon, that, you know, Facebook are all doing in order to make this happen. And so I don't think big is necessarily bad. Why? Well, like what's too big? The question is it helping the rest of society? And part of the reason I used manufacturing as an example is obviously we need a place where all of society is brought along on the new technological platforms for new jobs, for new kinds of opportunities for people, and that's something that we in the tech industry need to pay a lot of attention to, not just what do we do globally by creating great export products, which brings back a lot of interesting economics and capabilities back into the US, but also how do we help all these industries? Because all of these industries are in the process of technological revolution. Now, it doesn't mean that sometimes big isn't bad, but big by itself is not bad.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question, Reed, that you ask guests on your podcast, and I'm really curious for the answer here. What advice would you give to your high school self?
Well, fortunately, as you know, I actually wrote a book about this called The Startup of You, because I gave the commencement speech at my high school, and I was precisely scratching my head going, okay, what does a technology entrepreneur investor say to a bunch of high school students who are going to go out and be teachers and artists and creators and journalists and everything else? And it was be the entrepreneur of your own life. That the notion of a career ladder or career escalator, those are gone. It's now much more like a career jungle gym. And so you have to approach your life like an entrepreneur approaches their company. Now, as per your earlier question, that doesn't mean that everyone should go start a company, but the approach to a career is that. And for example, one kind of crisp thing to do is say, which smart risks can I take that give me an ability to kind of make interesting jumps in my career? And look for those risks. And what a smart risk is something that is not quite as risky as it looks and has a really good upside opportunity. And the reason other people aren't doing it is because it looks risky to them. And that kind of thing, thinking about that as career advice, would be something that you know, I learned the hard way and would have loved to apply earlier.
All right, Reid Hoffman, host of the Masters of Scale podcast, out with a new book, Masters of Scale, out today. Co-founder of LinkedIn, Greylock partner Reid, always good to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining. Coming up and away, aviation company Archer gets a step closer to FAA approval for its solution to urban air mobility. We're going to speak with the CEO coming up next. This is Bloomberg. An update now on a story we've been following. The Beijing city government is denying a report it's considering an investment in Didi that could put the Chinese ride hailer under state control. Bloomberg reported Friday that the municipal government had proposed that Shouqi Group, which is part of the Beijing Tourism Group, would acquire a stake in Didi. All this comes alongside a swath of penalties President Xi Jinping's administration is considering for Didi over data concerns since going public. Meantime, remember when we thought the Jetsons was a whole world away? Well, flying taxis at least are getting a step closer to reality. Santa Clara-based aviation startup Archer recently announced it's one step closer to securing FAA approval for their aircraft certification process. This a critical milestone as the race to commercialize flying taxis heats up. For more on what is next, I want to bring in Archer Aviation co-founder and CEO Adam Goldstein. Adam, thank you so much for joining us. So obviously the FAA's endorsement here is a big deal for you. What does this mean for Archer next?
Yeah, so thanks for having me on today. So Archer is building electric vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, and they're to be used in the urban air mobility market. And these are vehicles that will be affordable and designed to be as safe as commercial airlines. And so we're certifying these vehicles in the US with the FAA. And today we announced the first major milestone in this process by receiving what's called our G1 certification basis. And so we believe we're one of the only companies in our industry, really in the world, to have accomplished this step. And so it's a really significant one because this is one of the hardest parts of the entire certification planning process. So it's a really big deal. And by approving Archer's G1 certification basis, it's also really showing just the FAA has been, very forward thinking in working towards sustainable forms of air transportation.
When do you imagine commercial rollout would be? Joby Aviation, which of course is also working on air taxis, says they're going to be ready in 2024.
Yeah, so our certification timeline actually follows a similar pattern here. So we have announced that we think we can get through the certification process by the end of 2024. And we actually announced 2 of our early launch city partners where we'll be deploying the vehicles. And that's Los Angeles and in Miami.
How does Archer differ from Joby?
Yeah, so I think the industry of urban air mobility certainly has the potential to be a very big one. And I know we're both building vehicles that are out there to be deployed in this industry. But maybe if I could just focus on the Archer perspective, I mean, it's really a pretty unbelievable amount of momentum that you've seen across the entire industry. And specifically within Archer, I mean, we've announced a huge partnership this year with United Airlines, where they're going to be purchasing $1 billion of aircraft from us. They also have an option for another $500 million. And then we also announced a big partnership with the auto manufacturer Stellantis, which is the recent merger from Fiat Chrysler and Peugeot. And so you really look at the partners that have come into the urban air mobility market that are really helping this industry come to its form in 2024. And it really sets up for quite an attractive positioning here for the industry. And with the city partners between Los Angeles and Miami, it really, we're getting much closer, I think, than many people would actually think.
Now, you've been embroiled in a court battle with another company called Wisk, a rival air taxi company. They claim designs were stolen from them. Can you give us an update on this and on your position?
Yeah, so today is really about the momentum we've seen, with Archer, but we are very pleased with the court's recent ruling denying the preliminary injunction. And so, as we've stated out there, publicly, we believe the case has no merit and was really just brought as a way to stifle competition.
So you're planning to do a SPAC as well. Talk to us about what the money for that will allow and the vision, really. I mean, paint the Jetsonian picture of the future, if you will. How often will regular people be riding in an air taxi, to where and when?
So the industry has really come together, kind of a culmination of 3 big things that have happened. So one is regulatory. There is a framework in place that now will allow companies to certify these vehicles. The second is you've really seen this environment now where capital has become available to hardware companies. And I think, looking back historically, financing hardware companies was pretty challenging. And so you kind of have this setup here where, the third leg of the stool really is technology that's really evolved. And so the advancements we've seen with, electric powertrains, batteries and electric motors have gotten us to this point where the core ingredients are in place to have the industry actually come to life. And so now it's really all about getting through the certification process. And so we are making our way through that process. The G1 is really a good way to help the industry understand that there is a timeline now that we can start working towards, and helping everybody understand that the market will come to fruition as we expect in 2024. And so the progress that I think the entire industry has really seen across really those culmination of technology and capital and regulation all coming together, I think is really important. And then also you've seen recent announcements from Archer with the U.S. Air Force getting involved in our flight testing program. So you continue to see additional industry partners get involved, where the industry, I think, has become a very important asset to the U.S. And we're entering this new golden age of aviation, and I think it's important that the next big aerospace company is built here in America.
All right, Archer Aviation's Adam Goldstein. We'll keep our eye on you. Thank you so much for joining us. Meantime, two of the biggest aerospace companies in the United States have invested in a spacecraft refueling startup. Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin have joined in a financing round worth more than $10 million for Orbit Fab. The company plans to launch 2 refueling shuttles earliest next year. And after the break, Disney's new Marvel film breaks barriers at the box office and in diversity. We're going to have all the details from LA next. This is Bloomberg. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, the first Marvel film featuring an Asian actor as the star, dominated the weekend box office with an all-time record for a film opening over Labor Day, making an estimated $90 million in the U.S. and Canadian theaters over the 4-day weekend. Joining us to discuss, our Bloomberg entertainment reporter, Chris Palmieri. Chris, what should Hollywood filmmakers be taking away from this?
Well, this is another data point in a series now that suggests that, by including more people of color and more high-profile female roles, people will come out. And if you look at just the Marvel movies, Black Panther, Captain Marvel, or just the tremendous run that Asian-led movies are having with Crazy Rich Asians and Parasite winning Best Picture last year, and now this, there's plenty of information that suggests audiences of all kinds want a really diverse cast.
And you look at the cities where this was particularly successful, cities with high Asian populations like San Francisco, Honolulu, in my home state of Hawaii, Vancouver. Your reporting talks about how this film was a risk for Disney. At what point do filmmakers in Hollywood realize that it's not a risk anymore?
Yeah, I think that message is getting out. And by the way, there's a really terrific chase scene shot in San Francisco that's worth it price of admission alone. But that, when you see these numbers, this was a film that Disney decided to put only in theaters. They did it on Labor Day weekend, which is not a historically big weekend for movie-going. And so for that reason alone, it looked like it was going to be the top-grossing Labor Day release of all time, but it blew past everybody's expectations with $90 million and really helped lift the whole weekend. We haven't seen these numbers for 6-7 years. So, pandemic just tossed aside for this weekend.
Is it just this weekend, though? That's my next question. Only in theaters, obviously did well. Is this an inflection point for movies post-pandemic or an aberration?
Well, it's easy to get sort of excited with these big numbers with a particular release. We saw this with F9, the Fast and Furious sequel. We saw, really strong numbers with Black Widow in July, and people said, maybe we're getting used to coming back. My hunch is that that's not the case, that, if you have a movie people want to see, and a lot of people wanted to see Shang-Chi, especially if it's only available in theaters like F9 and this movie was, then people are going to come out, and so, it'll do pretty well next weekend as well, because there's no way to see it online, and it's a good movie. But does that mean 2-3 weeks from now, when there aren't as good movies teed up? I mean, they're already postponing films like the new Top Gun and that into next year. So it's not clear the theater industry is out of the woods.
Quickly, what are the next big releases you're watching for over the fall?
Well, we're going to watch to see if the James Bond one hangs in there, and if that leaves, that would actually be really bad news for the theater industry. So, it's still touch and go.
Okay. Chris Palmieri, our entertainment reporter in LA. Thanks, Chris, as always. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Make sure you tune in tomorrow. We're going to be joined by Daniel Dine, CEO of UiPath. He'll talk about the company's latest results. We'll have much, much more. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. This is Bloomberg.